Nowadays, the United States Grand Prix is held at the incredible circuit of the Americas that has proven time and time again as one of Herman Tilke's finest pieces of art among an endless sea of whatever that is. However, if we take a step back to the 1980s leading into the early 90s, and we get to see some of the terrible American street circuits used throughout this period, centered slap bang in the middle of major cities throughout the United States. These four circuits were the infamous Caesars Palace Street Circuit, which held the Caesars Palace Grand Prix in 1981 and 1982. Next was the Detroit Street Circuit, which held the Detroit Grand Prix from 1982 until 1988. After that came the Dallas Street Circuit, which held a one-off Dallas Grand Prix for only one round in 1984. And then finally came the Phoenix Street Circuit, which held the United States Grand Prix from 1989 until 1991. All four of these circuits are well renowned as some of the worst Grand Prix venues F1 has ever had the displeasure of hosting, sharing multiple common similarities between each other, such as the tarmac being ripped up by the torque of the F1 cars driving over it, and other issues out of their control, such as, more often than not, the temperature was just simply too hot, such as the aforementioned one-off Dallas Grand Prix in 1984, where temperatures reached up to 40 degrees Celsius, making it effectively a race of attrition. So let's begin with the first of these four terrible circuits, the notorious Caesars Palace Street Circuit, which hosted just two races throughout its time in Formula 1 in 1981 and 1982, and many would argue this is the worst F1 venue the sport has ever raced at for a magnitude of different reasons. The Caesars Palace Grand Prix was originally put into motion by Bernie Ecclestone at the start of the 1980s to be a spectacular and extravagant final Grand Prix of the season, with more money shifted towards fancy infrastructure instead of making the racing better, which is awfully familiar nowadays. But anyway, the Caesars Palace Street Circuit was pretty bizarre, to put it lightly. It wasn't even really a street circuit, as it was in fact laid out in the parking lot of the well-renowned Caesars Palace Hotel in Las Vegas as a large flat open space where architects could expand their creativity and make a fantastic temporary street circuit. Trouble is, that creativity didn't seem to fall through. Although the circuit was surprisingly wide, smoother than a lot of normal racetracks, and even containing runoff areas filled with sand, the circuit was ultimately not loved at all by the drivers, apparently putting huge amounts of strain on their necks due to the sheer amount of left-hand turns and repetitive nature. It also didn't help how scorching hot it was both times Formula 1 raced there, with Nelson Piquet allegedly taking 15 minutes to recover from heat exhaustion after just barely making it to the finish at the end of the 1981 race in which he won the title. And in fact, that was another problem with the circuit. It was the season finale for both 1981 and 1982, of which both came down to a somewhat disappointing championship decider. Again, this is sounding really familiar, but anyway, to summarise, the Caesars Palace Grand Prix is one of, if not the most terrible tracks to have ever graced F1. The track design was terrible, both Grand Prix drew in very little crowds, and ultimately ended up being a substantial loss for the hotel, only being used two more times in the kart championship, which is now what we know as IndyCar, before finally being completely dropped from all motorsports by the end of 1984. Good riddance. Now coming on to the second of these four woeful tracks, and we come on to by far the longest lasting of the lot, the Detroit Grand Prix circuit as host of the Detroit Grand Prix 7 times from 1982 to 1988. The Detroit Grand Prix circuit was a slow, winding course through the streets of Detroit, mostly 90-degree corners with a couple hairpins and chicane in between, resulting in an ultimately pretty dull track layout, which was not popular with both drivers and fans alike. Like Caesars Palace, the temperature was ridiculously hot, but unlike Caesars Palace, the Detroit Street Circuit was also notorious for being incredibly bumpy and very unforgiving should you make a mistake, as many drivers did, eventually giving it a reputation as a race of attrition, of which it would be considered an achievement if you just managed to finish the race. Most notably the fact that at least half of the grid retired before the end of the race in all 7 of the events held there, most notably the 1984 Detroit Grand Prix, of which 20 cars retired before the end of the race, with Jacques Laffite, Alain Prost, Theo Fabi, Elio De Angelis and eventual race winner Nelson Piquet as the only classified finished by the time the checkered flag had fallen. Just think about that for a second, 20 cars retiring, that's the same as the entire grid retiring in modern F1, and most of which weren't due to driver error, but instead due to the fact the cars just couldn't take it anymore, and started to break down or overheat. Furthermore, the tarmac itself was ripped up by the intense heat, combined with the torque of the Formula 1 cars driving over it, leading to the track slowly deteriorating as the race went on, with Senna comparing the surface of the 1988 race to being comparable to driving in the rain. And wouldn't you know it, that 1988 race would prove to be the last time F1 would race at Detroit, in favour of the Phoenix Street Circuit, which we'll get onto a bit later. But now we get onto the shortest lived of these American street circuits, the Dallas Street Circuit, as host of the one-off Dallas Grand Prix only used in 1984, and then quickly dropped from the calendar. What made this track so bad was, as previously mentioned, its intense heat, with temperatures reaching up to 40 degrees Celsius, leading to only 8 of the 26 starters of its sole Grand Prix successfully finishing the race, due to the exact same reasons as what made the Detroit Grand Prix such a painful challenge, with Keke Rosberg eventually taking the win. The funny thing is, the circuit wasn't particularly disliked itself, providing plenty of challenge for the drivers, but unfortunately, the ridiculous temperature once again broke away at the tarmac beneath the cars over time, and it was ultimately this tremendous heat that made the Grand Prix a one-off event never to be seen again. That's why there's really not a whole lot to talk about when it comes to this circuit. It was basically just a Detroit 2.0 with no real distinguishable features, except for the fact that the heat somehow was even more unbearable than in Detroit, famously leading to Nigel Mansell passing out while trying to push his Williams across the line, and other countermeasures such as driver Piercarlo Gonzani getting a bucket of ice water dumped over him during a pit stop. But now, as I said, there's not too much to talk about this circuit, literally only ever holding one race in any form of motorsport, and would never pop up again in years to come. So with that, we come on to the final track of these terrible American street circuits, the Phoenix Street Circuit as host of the United States Grand Prix from 1989 to 1991, and again, it was exactly the same thing as the previous ones. A boring layout made it hard to overtake, with temperatures once again way too high for the cars and drivers to cope with. But what is unique about the Phoenix Street Circuit is that it actually technically had 2 different layouts, one used in 1989 and 1990, and the other in 1991, both utilising streets around the city of Phoenix. The first layout was as bland as ever, with a chicane on the main straight and countless 90-degree corners, making it almost impossible to overtake, with the second layout used in 1991 not too much better, but most notably adding a hairpin at turn 5, followed by some quicker corners to follow. But either way you slice it, the circuit wasn't particularly notable. Unlike the others, it wasn't definably bad. The circuit was wide and smooth, allowing for a good amount of overtakes, but it was still painfully mediocre, providing no challenge for the drivers, with the onslaught of slow 90-degree corners and no excitement for the spectators for exactly the same reason. Each of the United States Grand Prix held at the Phoenix Street Circuit were won by the McLaren duo of Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost, and had at least 11 retirements each due to the extreme heat once again, and the track breaking up beneath the cars, with some more extreme examples such as a manhole cover being ripped up during a support race before the Grand Prix. Phoenix is probably the most unremarkable of the 4. The drivers generally disliked it, and the contract for a 1992 race was cancelled earlier in the year, leaving it to be never used again after the 1991 season. So there we go guys, that's it for this video, talking about this terrible set of American street circuits throughout the 1980s and early 90s that F1 has ever had the displeasure of racing at. So I'm going to end it off here. I hope you're all staying safe at home. Currently snowing here in London as of the recording of this video for the first time in quite some time, which is always nice. But anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe, comment, share, and I'll be back in the next video. See ya!